Welcome back. As the spoils of war, the United States continued to occupy the Okinawan Islands. They were in fact part of the United States. The American currency was used as the coin of the land. They drove on the wrong side of the road. President Nixon returned the Okinawan Islands back to a Japanese administration, but kept a couple of parcels for military bases. And in fact, the Okinawan Islands host more than 3/4 of all bases that are stationed in Japan. 20 years ago, the United States and Japan signed an agreement to return Futenma Air Base back to the Japanese. And Michael, not a lot has happened in 20 years, has it?
Very little. Some sand has moved at the Heneko Peninsula, and absolutely nothing has moved away from Futenma. Futenma is still a fully operating Marines air station. It's in an extremely dangerous location. It has been called the most dangerous military base on Earth. It sits right in the center of a highly populated area. There's no boundary area. There's no green belt protecting it.
It kisses right up to the barrier.
It's right up to the fence. There's been one major accident involving a helicopter that came down into a university. No one was hurt. It was a very lucky situation, but everyone talks about the next time it happens. Now, there have been, in the past, fatal air accidents involving Okinawa. There haven't been any in a very long time, but nevertheless, everyone says this base has to go.
Right.
But replacing it with a new facility has been almost the Achilles heel of Japanese governments now for 20 years. The promise made in April of 1996 was that in 5 to 7 years, Futenma would be closed, returned to the Japanese, and a new base would take over within Okinawa, would take over the forces. It will be a new base, but it has to be within an existing base. That was the agreement made by the United States and Japan 20 years ago. Well, we're 13 years past the cutoff date, and nothing has happened.
Right. They need to relocate to a similar situation, but Futenma is massive. I mean, when you look at an aerial photograph, it looks like a giant blob that is open, surrounded by just a very densely populated area.
They need a significantly long runway. Now, Futenma is mostly for helicopters, but the Marines also like to bring in larger aircraft, and particularly aircraft for transporting cargo. And that requires some kind of lengthy span of concrete on which to land an aircraft. That has been the sticking point. And it's been a sticking point in that the location that they selected, which is an existing base on the Heneko Peninsula, does not have on it any space for a sufficiently long runway. So a runway has to be built on landfill out into Nago Bay.
Site selection.
The site selection...
There are so few places that actually could accommodate it.
Well, that's according to the United States Department of Defense and according to the Japanese government. The view of the government of Okinawa is very different. In fact, they say it doesn't even have to be here. It can be in some other prefecture, or it could even be in the United States on the island of Guam, anywhere but here.
A reasonable argument.
And they say it doesn't have to be here. And don't put it here because we already have 73% in terms of land area, not slightly more in terms of forces. The promise that's made between the United States and Japan on defending Japan, Okinawa bears the burden.
Sure it does.
And that's unfair. Move it to another part of Japan, share the pain as well as the profit.
Right.
Now, there have been security issues that have made it a little bit more complicated than that simple argument. When the agreement was signed, a few years later, we had the DPRK lofting the Taepodong missile over the Japanese archipelago, which triggered a vast improvement of the military relationship between Japan and the United States. Japan, which was sort of fumbling in the 90s, should we move closer to China? Should we try to have a triangular relationship? Suddenly found they had a great friend in the United States. Yeah. And that relationship has become ever closer since that time. So the idea that we need a new base there made sense and became more sensible. More recently, the shift has been from the north to the west, where we have the Senkaku Islands and China's active attempt to change the status quo as to who's administering those islands so that it can possibly someday take them over. That, of course, has also increased the value of the U.S. forces in that area, so that we have the political world outside of Okinawa impinging upon the decision, so that the Japanese government has, even though this is such a marginal issue for them normally, just who cares? Well, okay, we'll move it somewhere else. They actually have to deal with, okay, these have to be in a specific place, and the United States has to be pleased with where that place is, and that's Heneko.
Well, Okinawa has always been strategically important because of its geopolitical position. I mean, it is in the
right in the middle.
Right in the middle. It's a great location.
And Taiwan's a reasonable distance. The coast of Fujian is a reasonable distance. Kyushu is a reasonable distance. Even parts of the economic exclusion zone, the EEZ of Korea, are in a reasonable distance from Okinawa. Yeah, and traditionally, in fact, prior to the Meiji Restoration, it was so important to all the countries in the region that they shared sovereignty there. Okinawa was a kingdom that was both a tributary to the Emperor of China and also under the administration of the daimyo of Satsuma.
Right.
And they all got along for 250 years with 3 different administrations running that same island because no one wanted to give it up to somebody else. Right. And that's the same situation sort of exists today in the Senkakus. The Chinese government does not want to give up on them, even though they're worthless rocks. And neither does the Japanese government.
Right.
And they're stuck with that. And that bleeds on down to the U.S. presence on Okinawa.
Okay, but Okinawa is a bit different. Think about this. It used to belong to the United States, free and clear. They reverted it.
They were under the Peace Treaty of 1951. The United States was given administration of these islands, but the actual sovereignty of them was not in question. It was Japanese territory occupied by the United States, but unlike the rest of Japan, which was returned to sovereignty in 1952, Okinawa stayed in for 20 years, U.S. administered.
Okay,
because it was the stepping stone for the Vietnam War.
Sure, but the United States did not have to return all of it back to Japan, but they did. I thought it was a good move that they did it, but they don't have to return all of it. And my point is that when they returned it, it was covered with all sorts of secret agreements, and we're going to be doing this, and we won't do that, and even the storage of nuclear weapons was a point of great contention there. But having an air base like Futenma, they can keep that there. They don't have to do anything about it, but they're doing it for a political, motive. But the United States has these bases there, and probably when it reverted everything back to a Japanese administration, one of the deals was we get to keep these pieces of land unless there's some sort of trade that's going on within that prefecture.
The question, though, for Tokyo has always been, does the Prime Minister have the authority and the political oomph, if you will, in order to get this deal done? And the answer has been repeatedly no. No, we can't do this. It's too controversial. There'll be scenes of people being pried off the front of U.S. bases, being taken away by police officers. Persons could get hurt. Some of them are senior citizens. They could even get killed. We would be in total crap if we ever did this. And so every prime minister has just handed it off to the next prime minister, and they just keep handing it off until the real change happened in 2009 when Hatoyama, leading his DPJ to what was eventual victory, made a promise that the Futenma for Heneko deal is dead. Futenma and its functions would be moved outside the prefecture or even outside of Japan. That completely changed the dynamic. The Okinawan electorate became radicalized.
More emboldened.
They became very bold. They said, okay, you see, we were right. You didn't have to be here.
Right.
And even though Hatoyama reversed himself within a year and ratified the deal that had already existed that had been done in 96, nevertheless, the people of Okinawa are off on that. We were cajoled into agreeing to this back in the mid-90s. We don't have to now.
We see a little bit of daylight here, more coalitions, more cohesion among the people who are voting in Okinawa. Let's kick those guys out.
And they kicked their butts in the 2014 House of Representatives elections, wiping out the entire LDP slate that was there running on the districts. Those candidates eventually revived themselves as zombies in the proportional list, and so they're still floating around. But the antagonism is so great that the Okinawans even managed to elect the first communist district seat holder since the 1993 revision of the districts into single-member districts.
That's huge.
They are absolutely rejecting all deals that Tokyo has made. But the thing is, the Heneko to Futenma to Heneko deal is the only deal on the table with the United States. Right. So for every prime minister, it's been handed off, until we came to Abe. Abe said, we're going to build it. And dang it, he started pushing people out of the way, and they started doing the construction survey work. But that didn't go so well, did it?
No, it hasn't gone well, and
we have this process that's now going on, which a judge has ordered come to some sort of agreement, which has given the government some breathing room while we get through Hokkaido 5 and possibly the House of Councilors election before it comes back down with a hammer on the Okinawans and saying, you have to accept this deal.
Right.
Well, we'll be seeing. We know that there's going to be no agreement.
Judicial activism, the political process, the election in Hokkaido.
All those things are going to happen, and then the government, if Mr. Abe is still strong after the House of Councilors election, then we're probably going to see more conflict.
The Futenma Air Base relocation issue, an issue that just refuses to die. Please stay tuned.